Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering our third installment of World War II, and this is going to be called Life on the American Home Front between 1941 and 1945. So in theory, the United States was the largest military power in the world. It had a large population, an ample supply of natural resources, an advanced infrastructure, and a capital base that was becoming more solid by the day. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which gave Roosevelt the means to fight World War II. Roosevelt went on to create hundreds of programs, and because of the acronyms that those programs were named after, they were called alphabet soup. And this alphabet soup was to help aid the war effort at home. Now, the United States had to figure out how to supply the war effort and the Allies with the supplies needed to fight. Roosevelt created the War Production Board. Roosevelt wanted to make the United States the quote-unquote arsenal of democracy, and the War Production Board oversaw the conversion of personal product factories into war effort factories. Automobile companies would no longer make automobile engines for personal use, but they would produce engines for planes and tanks, and radio companies would be creating bombs instead of radios. Many factories would change over to military usage during this time of warfare. The United States also needed to make its military force bigger. The peacetime draft created a military that numbered around 1.5 million men. By the time the war ended, that number would rise to about 12 million members. A more rigorous recruitment process was needed to fill the ranks in the armed forces. President Roosevelt championed a more expansive draft, and with a little help from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the president created women's auxiliary forces for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. As a result of the massive draft, the employment sector experienced a huge labor shortage. And because of the draft, most men went off to war. Coupled with the new expansive draft, the factories were left empty. And to combat this, a work or fight propaganda campaign was waged. Rosie the Riveter propaganda posters beckoning housewives to leave the home and enter the nation's factories. The campaign worked. During the war years, over 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time. Now, two other groups of Americans were affected by World War II as well. African Americans and Mexican Americans made significant advances during World War II. Overseas, African Americans were able to serve in segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen. At home, African Americans continued the second Great Migration northward, filling vacated factory jobs. Many African Americans were celebrating the Double V campaign, which meant a victory at home with democracy and a victory abroad with the war effort. Mexican Americans were allowed to cross the border and assist with the harvest season in the southwest United States. This was called the Bracero Guest Worker Program. Mexican Americans came out of retirement, and more teenagers pitched in to fill the demand for the new labor shortage. The United States government spent over twice as much money fighting World War II as it had spent on all previous wars, events, or programs since its creation. To help pay for World War II, taxes were raised to try and generate revenue and control inflation. Some people in the United States were getting taxed as high as 90%. However, this was not enough. Just like the First World War, the government launched Liberty and Victory loan drives. The war bonds, just like during the First World War, would be sold up front with the promise that if you kept it, the government would give you back the original amount plus interest as long as you promised to hold on to the bond. According to the Department of the Treasury, more than 85 million Americans, or approximately half the population of the United States, purchased bonds totaling a whopping $185.7 billion. The size of the government also tripled during the years of World War II, from roughly 1 million people to over 3 million people. Now, during World War I, the United States was able to raise enough food and supplies to aid in the war effort. However, this war was different. The only way the government saw fit to fight World War II was to ration or fix the consumption of goods. Americans were issued stamp books for key war items like gas, sugar, meat, canned foods, butter, rubber, shoes, and fuel oil. It was illegal to purchase any of those items without the use of a stamp. People were told to drive slower and to carpool or to share rides to conserve fuel. Americans also started to grow backyard gardens called victory gardens that were able to produce approximately 8 million tons of food for the soldiers. The Boy Scouts of America would lead scrap metal and rubber drives. They would collect worn or not used metal and rubber to supply the factories. Consumer goods like refrigerators and automobiles were not being produced, and women would draw stockings onto their legs. By 1945, the Navy had over 90,000 vessels, the Army over 80,000 tanks, and the Air Force nearly 300,000 aircraft, all produced during the war years. Millions of machine guns and rifles and billions of ammunition cartridges rolled off American production lines. New industries like synthetic rubber flourished, and old ones were rejuvenated. Now let's talk about a time in American history that is not very well looked upon as the past. And this is what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II in Japanese-American internment. And during World War II, over 125,000 Japanese American citizens were imprisoned in internment camps. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor led to a paranoia of the Japanese. Without any evidence, these Japanese Americans were suspected of remaining loyal to Japan, and many of them were thought to be spies and a security risk. Many Americans also feared a West Coast invasion because of the large Asian population dating back to the gold rush era of the 1849-1850s. Roosevelt was forced, due to popular societal opinion, to do something about this problem. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which relocated all Americans of Japanese ancestry to concentration camps in the interior of the United States. Posted in Japanese American communities were evacuation orders, which gave instructions on how to comply with the executive order. Many families sold their homes, their stores, and most of their assets with the notion that their homes and livelihoods would still be there upon their return. Because of the mad rush to sell, properties and investors were often sold at a fraction of their true value. Almost 2/3 of the interns were Nisei, or Japanese American, born in the United States. It made no difference that many had never even been to Japan. Even Japanese American veterans of World War I were forced to leave their homes. There were ultimately 10 camps created in the most remote areas in the 7 western states. The Japanese Americans lived mostly in cheaply made barracks. The people would dine in halls together, and children were expected to attend schools on property. Adults had the option to work for a small amount of pay. Roosevelt had hoped that the Japanese Americans could farm on the land. However, because of the climate, farming was nearly impossible. Evacuees elected representatives to meet with government officials to air their grievances. Recreational activities were organized to pass the time. Some volunteered to fight in 1 or 2 all-Nisei Army regiments and went on to distinguish themselves in battle. Life in relocation camps was very poor. They were too cold in the winter, too hot in the summer, and the daily life resembled Army boot camps. The food was bland, and if they tried to flee, they would be shot on sight. So who tries to take the government on in Japanese relocation? And this is Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu tried to take on the U.S. government to court over the relocation of Japanese Americans. It was met with resistance. In Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court justified the executive order as a wartime necessity, meaning that in wartime, certain citizens did not receive equality under the law. When the order was repealed, many found that they could not return to their hometowns, and hostility against Japanese Americans remained high all across the United States. All right, guys, that was America at home during the war. Join us next time on our next segment when it's America winning the war in Europe. I'll see you next time.